It gives me great pleasure now to introduce Noeleen Heyzer, who is the director of the United Nations Development Fund for Women, where she serves as the United Nations Chief Advocate for Gender Mainstreaming within the institution and internationally. She is the former head of the Gender and Development Program in the Asian Pacific Development Center in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and founding member of Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era Dawn, a network of women leaders. She has lectured and published extensively, most recently on the subject of women and the process of globalization.
A very good morning, everyone, and a big welcome to the Beijing +5 process. Let me start by saying that when women prepared for the Fourth World Conference on Women, it was not actually a World Conference on Women, it was Women's Conference on the World. Because it was really women trying to shape their perspectives on what was happening to their lives in the context of what was happening in development and what is happening in the world. 5 years later, where are we now? What came out of Beijing was called an agenda for women's empowerment. And let me stress what we mean by empowerment before I go on. It has two major components. One is an internal one, internal to the lives of women. In other words, the sense of self-worth, the kind of competence to reshape your environment and so on. But equally important is the other side of empowerment, and that is the removal of barriers in the context within which women live. So in other words, to really locate the lives of women in grounded realities, and what I call the grounded realities of women's lives, and to remove the barriers that allow women to use the agency of empowerment. What is really equally important when we talk of leadership and empowerment is the word power. And here, what women has tried very hard to do from the time of Beijing till now is the understanding of what power is all about. And for us, we have suffered tremendously as women in terms of power over the kind of patriarchal use of power, the kind of hierarchies which we have seen. And what women have tried to do is to transform that notion of power so that it is power to, is power to be with, to facilitate, to learn with, to create, to facilitate. So, and if you use power to create, that kind of power has no barriers, it has no boundaries. And it in fact creates what we call the synergies of relationship. In other words, the whole and the outcome of that whole is much larger than each of its component parts. Now with those two concepts, where are we in terms of the Beijing +5, 5 years later, where are we in terms of all this? What we know that we have at the eve of the opening of the Beijing +5 meeting on Monday is the fact that over 120 countries have actually come up with gender action plans and commitments by governments on the whole area of bringing about gender equality. But in terms of implementation and in terms of the kind of transformation that has actually occurred, there's much left to be desired. And why is that so? I mean, there are many reasons. People say it's due to lack of technical know-how, it is because of lack of resources, and in other words, there is some kind of political will as expressed or indicated by these policies, but somehow it doesn't get implemented into action. So what has happened? For me, a number of things. Firstly, it's easier to have words. It's much harder to have action, because action shows where the real commitment is. And therefore, Beijing +5 have to ask for real commitments. And real kinds of commitments that we're looking at requires really an allocation of resources for women's priorities. And much of the things that we as UNIFEM have been trying to do is to ask governments to relook at not the women's programs or the women's budget as such, but the engendering of the whole national budget. Where are your priorities? Where have you spent your money? And therefore, that is one very major concern. But at the same time, we need a strong constituency, a constituency that is inside and outside. In other words, we need civil society, to put pressure on governments, we need the kind of partnerships to get us there. But the world has changed, and therefore, what is different from the Beijing meeting and now is the fact that whilst it is our states that have made these commitments, and of course there are very many different kinds of states. There are states that are really for social development and for women's empowerment, and there are those that are not really interested in it at all. So you have a variation of states. But even with that kind of a framework, what has changed is the fact that we have the whole issue and challenges of globalization. And globalization, in a sense, means that it is not, whilst your state has made the commitments at international forum of all the different kinds, the state alone is not capable, for a variety of reasons, to implement those recommendations. And we need to hold other stakeholders accountable as well. Your corporations, the people who have actually shaped or have not shaped the rules of globalization in such a way that actually allow the recommendations and the targets of human development to be met. Now, what do we mean by globalization? It's basically 4 different components if we're talking about economic globalization. It looks at trade and what has been happening to the trade agenda, and I don't have to tell many of you some of the issues there. It looks at investment, it looks at the flow of capital, and it looks at technology. And for today's meeting, let me focus mainly on technology, because that's what we are interested in, and in terms of, at least for this particular meeting. What is really interesting for me is how fast this technology has grown. But then at the same time, we also know that this technology will only benefit those who are well placed in their knowledge to use this technology, or in terms of the language, and this is very much the access issue. The issue of who, in fact, have access to the new wealth, if you like, especially as society is evolving into more and more a learning society, a knowledge-based kind of society. And I call this a new wealth, because if you look at what is happening to our societies, when it was an agricultural-based society, land was the basis of wealth. When it shifted on to an industrial-based kind of society, the means and control over production was equally important. When it moved to a service society, the capacity to build your alliances, to bargain and to fight for the right kinds of prices is extremely important. But when you move to knowledge-based society, those who have access to the technology, but also those who have access to the generation of what is regarded as knowledge is extremely important. And therefore, the whole definition of what is knowledge and what is learning, and whose knowledge is being learned, whose knowledge is being shaped. And therefore, the issue is not just one of access to the technology, but also of the issue of leadership and empowerment within the framework of the generation of that kind of knowledge, and the capacity to be engaged in a particular dialogue, so that it is not just one view or one message that is recognized as knowledge. But equally important there is what is called the regulations. In other words, to our surprise, the whole so far cyberspace has been seen as some kind of a common good, but increasingly there's a privatization of some of those cyberspaces. But what is also extremely important is the fact that not very many women actually have access, even if they have the knowledge, to the regulation of that knowledge, so that you have to deal with what is called your patenting of information, because that becomes the new wealth. And women actually have been trying very hard to say that we have given a lot of things free because it was part of the common good. So where are the valuation? we are operating in an entirely different value system where there is monetization of particular sort, of which women is not very much a part of. And that what we want is a kind of sharing and protection of women's knowledge as well. Now what we have done at UNIFEM is to play very particular emphasis on new information technology. As Manas is known, we have supported the Sisterhood is Global in the largest ever grant given by UNIFEM to any organization to build leadership of women in the Arab world using information technology. We have provided the Women's Human Rights Network with another almost equally large grant to help build the Women's Human Rights Net. But at UNIFEM itself, the work on violence against women has taken hold in a very strong way. And we started off with Genesis Health by establishing, for the first time in the UN, a listserv that linked women from throughout the world, 2,000 women, actually 2,300 women, to be engaged in a conversation of ending violence in women's lives. And we also, through her help, was able to organize a major video conference in the General Assembly to show some of the best strategies that have emerged through our campaigns in Latin America, Africa, Asia. And this video conference linked basically 5 sites from around the world. And I'm very happy today when you look at the New York Times that UNICEF has picked on this. It is a kind of mainstreaming, but I also wish that they will recognize the work of the women's groups and the Women's Fund in pushing this, because it was very much a women's issue. I mean, if you look at where it was, when everybody was so scared to address this particular issue, it was women's power and women's courage that put it on the agenda. Then it was used by the Women's Network to push the UN at the human rights meeting to recognize this as a major issue. The UN accepted it, but it was more in terms of a convention. Then the GA asked UNIFEM to establish a trust fund and to pick this up in a more serious way in the UN system, and we did that. And we did that in a very interagency framework. And now, UNICEF, as one of the largest programs in the UN, is picking it up. And I feel that that's a very good approach. But at the same time, I hope it's not words, but it is also the allocation of resources to women to make sure that the ending and the eradication of violence actually happens in women's lives. And there, I think, is how women could also pressurize the UN in order to make sure that what is picked up in words get converted into action. Now, based on all this, we have also feel that whilst we see this as what I call e-consult, in other words, electronic consultation of women, and also the prioritization of women's knowledge, to really recognize women as a knowledge creator and to use their experiences as grounded knowledge, so that they are seen as leaders in that sense. So whilst this is one very major way, there are other ways in which we have used information technology. Yet another way is e-commerce. So we, in our work at the ground, especially in the work in Africa, in Western Africa, have been able to create sites where we are able to showcase some of women's products and to get the best pricing for women using the electronic commerce, or what is called the virtual souk. We have also built a partnership again with HomeNet, which is where we feel that if you have women located mainly in the homes, then how do we use the technology in such a way that we create better market access and cut the middlemen, and therefore making sure that the buying and selling actually goes directly to women. So what I'm saying here is that the future is actually using women's leadership to transform the nature of globalization, and also to transform the kind of technology, the use of the technology in such a way that it could lead to the empowerment of women. I would like to say that the difference also in terms of Beijing +5 now is the way the consultation have actually taken place. Based on this major work on ending violence in women's lives, the whole UN system has actually used that as a model to create consultations with women's groups from around the world in all the 12 areas of critical concern as identified in the platform for action. And Janice, again, was one of the people who helped us in that. So you actually have a very, the best, I think, here, because she definitely has helped us a lot. And what we were very pleased to actually do was to use a consultation. In fact, 10,000 women participated in those discussion lists, and the findings and their perspectives on empowerment and leadership. Thank you.